Season 4 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Daniel Murphy, Polar Inertia, a journal of nomadic and popular culture, online at polarinertia.com, and Medivate, a community and set of tools to help you build the kind of meditation practice you'd like to have, online at medivate.com. Give me a sense of the feeling of being in your own place, in its final days as your place. In the guest seat, where you're usually in the host seat. I mean, what are you feeling this dire reversal right now? The tables have turned on you?
You've been kind enough to offer a scenario here, Colin, where I have the man school set up in reverse, which I thank you for. It's kind of nice. The one thing that's kind of taking me out of it is the fact that my apartment is full of boxes.
Yes.
Because I'm moving in 2 days, so it's almost like it's not my place. So I almost feel like we're in an entirely new situation because I would be facing my bookcase now, except there's no books in it. So I know sometimes I've sat here before and I'm like, oh yeah, that's right, I have that book. But now I can't see any titles or things like that.
It is a freshly alienized environment to do this interview in. On, by the way, Notebook on Cities and Culture. I am Colin Marshall. I've just spoken the name of the show. Speaking it here, by the way, in the soon-to-be former apartment of Caleb Bacon, my guest today, who is a writer on television and on not television, and a podcaster, formerly of the Gentleman's Club. That was his first podcast. Now he's on his even more successful second podcast, Man School, a school for exactly that. The name does not lie. It's a show about how we can best be men in the 21st century. We'll get on to that. Tell me first, this is the intersection of Los Feliz, of Thai Town, of Little Armenia. How can you bear to move away from this melting pot?
I've lived in this apartment for 9.5 years, which I think is a world's record for apartment dwelling in Los Angeles.
9.5? Yeah, I think it must be.
Yeah, I don't know anyone who's lived in an apartment this long. It's not necessarily a badge of honor. It's a badge of convenience. And the East Hollywood area has served me well, and good central location, and I can walk to cheap Thai food as I often do.
You came here from Albany, New York, which is what kind of a contrast? Just Los Angeles, Albany. Put that up for me.
I basically moved out here for good times and good weather, and Albany was devoid of good times and good weather, so that's the contrast.
Completely devoid? I mean, we talked earlier off mic about road trips to Boston, to New York, to Montreal, all within kind of reach.
Yeah, I would say 2.5 to 3.5 hours, all those places.
That's kind of reach, right?
I think so. I mean, look, if you drive in certain directions from here 3 hours, you're in the middle of nowhere.
Right.
And at least in the Northeast, there's all these major metropolitan areas. So that was definitely a main advantage to being there.
You write for television, as I mentioned. Right now, you are, well, actually, why should I could pitch this show. Let me have your best pitch for the show you're working on now.
Sullivan and Son.
Yes, indeed.
It is a sitcom, a situation comedy, shot in front of an audience, old school style, that takes place in a bar, much like the show Cheers. However, it's in a working class part of Pittsburgh, which is like a multi-ethnic area, sort of like the one we're in right now. So that gives us an opportunity to make racist jokes. Indeed.
And you host, of course, Behind the Bar, the podcast of Sullivan and Son.
That's right. Yeah, my third podcast.
Indeed. Tell me, was this a situation where your podcasting acumen was known in your workplace and they said, we're going to have a podcast, maybe Caleb Bacon should be doing it?
Yes, that's exactly what happened.
Really?
And to me, that was fantastic. Like, just when they asked me to do it, it was an idea somebody had there. And it was one of those things where I felt like, even if somehow it didn't happen, I just felt great that they asked me to do it.
How does it feel to be simultaneously in, quote unquote, the new media, podcasting, and to be working on a sitcom that is, I won't say self-consciously, but almost deliberately an old-school sitcom?
Oh, that's a good point. I don't think I've ever really thought about it like that. But yeah, I mean, an old-school sitcom is as old as it gets. And I think that's also why a lot of people, when they crap on sitcoms today, it's because they're so used to watching things that are more evolved. Whether it's Curb Your Enthusiasm or Breaking Bad, it makes it harder to watch something with, a little bit cheaper sets. And,
right.
It's like, because you're basically just putting on a little play for the audience. So I don't know. I think there's just things that I love about both. So I just get to scratch different itches.
Was television writing the dream that brought you here besides the good times and good weather, or was it comedy writing, or was writing even in your mental picture of this place when you came over from Albany?
I'm a simple man, sometimes too much so. And one of those things that makes me simple is I'm not a good dreamer.
Oh.
So to me, good times and good weather, I was just like, all right, that's all I want. And then I got here and it was like I had achieved that dream.
Right.
But I had an entry-level job opportunity in television. And then once I just started to work on some different shows, it was just like, oh, this is good. This is a good world for me, and let's figure out what I do want to do and what I don't want to do. And I'd always had a passion for writing, and it was just something that I had excelled in different ways. And then thankfully I had some opportunities after being here just a couple years, and it's been a grind, but I've definitely enjoyed the path.
I meet so many people here who just dragged themselves out to Los Angeles from New York City or from Europe or from wherever, from a long distance. They forced themselves to come here, didn't want to, but their dream was, I want to write on television, one of these television shows that I admire so much, that the world admires so much. I've got to write on television, and they're clawing their way toward that. You're telling me, Caleb Bacon, that you came here just 'cause, essentially, and hey, television, why not?
Yeah, I mean, that makes me sound a little bit more proficient at life than is perhaps the case. But I think, actually, a lot of people that I've worked with who are working television writers, that was not their dream.
Really?
Yeah, there's a bunch of people I know who are actors, who are stand-ups, who just took these different paths, and they discovered writing along the way. And my version of that was I just took behind-the-scenes crew work and found writing along the way.
When did podcasting enter the picture? I mean, you've said you've been here 9.5 years. Podcasting itself is, what are we in? We're in 2013 now. Podcasting itself isn't even 10 years old, right? So the medium got invented, and then Los Angeles is very much a podcasting mecca after you got here, right?
Yeah, it was. I had a college radio background, and I'd done some. I'd been like a guest on some shows, kind of growing up, randomly. Terrestrial radio. And then it was about 2009. Yeah, it was summer 2009. I launched the Gentleman's Club with my then co-host, Tim Hammer. And we were both writing for this Los Angeles blog, LAist. And we decided to do that. And that was a couple months after Adam Carolla launched his podcast. That was the same summer Mark Maron launched his, Chris Hardwick. And there was a real boom that summer.
The great boom of 2009 in podcasting.
As nobody
09.
knows it, but they should.
Yes, well, we've coined it here tonight. The Gentleman's Club, it is in some ways so similar and in some ways so vastly different from your current podcast, Man School. Why, I suppose, other than being a man, why do either show? Why do a show based on men's interest, shall we say?
I feel like I connect with men's interests because I have a lot of them. I'm definitely not a bro-y kind of guy.
Right.
But when
the collar on your polo shirt is down, it's not popped up, so that's in your favor right there.
That's true, and it is purple, so I don't know how that qualifies me, but just so the listener gets a better picture here.
What's the broiest color it could be? Potentially. Assume your collar was popped. What's the shirt look like?
I feel like a clean white polo shirt is
That's the broiest.
Good and broy. Yeah. Mixed in with a pair of cargo shorts.
Indeed. I was going to say that's the bro of 1999, but I guess the bro endures look-wise. I mean, they're basically the same as they were in the last century, looks-wise.
Yeah, I'm thinking of your typical bro, not your Jersey Shore variety, which is also more popular these days. Your Ed Hardy rhinestone encrusted.
Indeed. But you were not broy. You had a set of interests that qualify as what qualifies as men's interests, the maleist interests that you found yourself enjoying.
My friend and I, when we started the show, we had this attitude, and I think it was the correct attitude, was, look, nobody knows who we are. We're basically bloggers. And, we had some Twitter followers and things like that, but, nobody knew who we were. So we wanted to do a show where we could focus on some content that people might be interested in, not just in the Caleb and Tim Talk About Stuff podcast.
A very common theme, by the way. Not always Caleb and Tim, but Talk About Stuff is... I mean, it's easy to do.
The Gab Fest, is that's what you call it?
The Gab podcast? The Gab... I mean, there's Slate uses the word gabfest, but just, yeah, you didn't want to have a gab podcast.
No.
No gab right away.
So we basically, we took a focus of what we thought men find interesting, and that's from a place of sports, sexuality, and lifestyle.
And you combined, as I recall, those themes on the Gentleman's Club in a way that, what struck people most is you had comedians and porn stars. And it kind of broke down to being about half and half, right? Half comedian, half porn star, 1 week porn star, 1 week comedian.
Yeah, what happened was Tim moved out of town, and I turned the show into a one-on-one interview program, keeping with the same themes. But when you do a one-on-one show, basically the tone of your show is very much to do with who your guest is. So a lot of times I'd have a comedian on 1 week, and then another week I'd have on a porn star.
Right.
And so basically it was almost like I was doing two different shows. Like the brand was entirely split in half, and then a lot of people would write me up saying some pretty crass things about those porn stars.
Yes.
Not like, oh boy, would I like to do things to her. It was like, she makes me want to rip my ears out. Those people, you're supposed to watch them on film, do their work. You're not supposed to listen to them.
Right. But did you think, even at the time, were you like, that's a bitter listener, what are you going to do? These are the reviews you get as a podcaster. This is what happens on the net. Or were you like, I have a point. You're not supposed to hear them.
It was both.
I see.
I was fortunate enough to have interviewed a few charismatic porn stars.
Who would count as some of the surprisingly charismatic porn stars?
I would say Caden Cross is not only surprisingly charismatic, she's especially charismatic. And that was the second porn star interview I ever did. She sat on this very couch in this very apartment, and my God, had I met my match. I was head over heels, but at the same time, she's just so quick and smart and interesting that I was blown away. Right,
and the quality of being a porn star is not a deterrent to you. Was not a deterrent at that time. You were like, hey, you had thought you had met your match, even though that match happened to be a porn star.
I was not looking to introduce her to my mother.
Yes, sure.
And nor was she looking to be introduced to my mother, or my crotch.
Indeed. Well, these things happen. But you wrote once that you would get situations where they'd just be accompanied by weird handlers. Was a weird handler the norm with the porn stars?
One of the things was like, when you called me when you got here, to come down and get you.
Right. I'm down at the gate.
Right. I would get those calls, and I would not know who I was going to see. So I would open up the gate, and sometimes it would be a girl, or the girl with her publicist, or a girl with her figure who was like a boyfriend / manager / occasional porn star / marijuana dealer. Sure. I'm assuming. But there was one guy once, and this sort of made my day, perhaps my life. I was interviewing this rather busty porn star, and I go down, and she is with her colleague, who is a male porn star, who in the middle of the day on Saturday afternoon was drinking a Four Loko. She's just walking down the street drinking a Four Loko.
We should. Four Loko isn't around anymore, so we should explain what this is. It's some sort of fortified energy drink.
It was some sort of mixture of malt liquor and an energy drink.
Right.
In such a way where there was a lot of reports of people just kind of going crazy on it. And so not only did he have an illegal open container, he had a Four Loko. He was just, it was such
some taste, porn star guy.
He was showing taste, Colin, and his taste was perfectly porn.
It was revealed. I mean, tell me about, with your experience, this is the last thing I'm going to ask about the porn stars, but did your experience interviewing porn stars on the Gentleman's Club essentially confirm everything we think about porn stars and the taste thereof, the world thereof, the culture thereof?
I would say so. I'm a sober guy. I'm someone who's done a lot of therapy, and I've done a lot of work on myself. And so I feel like because of that, I may have a little advantage in spotting things in others. So I think if you interview the average porn star and say, were you molested? They will probably say no, because there's probably a significant amount of detachment from any such trauma.
Right.
Especially if it involves some, addiction as well. But there were some girls who came over here who definitely were on some sort of pill cocktail that gets them through the day.
Oh, jeez.
And so to me, it was all confirmed.
You could tell they didn't take all that in because they were coming on the Gentleman's Club. That wasn't making them nervous. That was their daily regimen.
Not so much. No, they were certainly not nervous. But the one thing I would say about the porn stars also is that they're used to having people listen to them. So the ones who were not good talkers, that did not deter them from speaking a great deal.
They still talked. They just didn't talk as you and I would know it.
No, they didn't have a point.
That's what I mean. We, as you and I know it, we're having a conversation. They would just spout.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Pretty
see.
much. But I definitely grew out of it. But at the beginning, the novelty of I can have porn stars into my apartment, that pretty much made like high school Caleb back in Albany, New York, just smile ear to ear.
But in a more lasting way, in a way that had more lasting benefits, you also realized you could have comedians in your apartment.
Yeah, but I didn't doubt that they would come over.
Sure. I mean, they're going to come over, but they were able, I'm sure, to... Well, what could they contribute to your sort of comedy writing consciousness? Did you start with having any of that when you were first interviewing comedians? How much did talking to comedians contribute to your abilities to engage with the craft of humor as you do it now?
I think it just gave me an appreciation for people's backgrounds. For example, interviewing like a Paul Rust or a Paul Scheer, who've got big improv backgrounds.
Right.
I got to experience like just how generous they were when there was a situation where we were kind of co-creating something humorous together. Whereas just interviewing stand-ups, they're used to being a solo person who will plow through things,
right.
to get their point across. And so that was not adversarial, but it wasn't as complimentary.
I get the sense in the Gentleman's Club days, it sounds, again, I'll bring it up, porn stars and comedians, that great divide you were straddling, shall we say. It does give you a picture of some stratum of the entertainment business in Los Angeles that, I mean, tell me the perspective it gave you on it, because you were able to get these people in front of mics, you were able to talk to them, and you were seeing these two poles of the entertainment tent, comedians and porn stars. That's holding a lot of the whole operation up here in Los Angeles, isn't it? I mean, that's people talk about the Valley and how much of that is porn, how much is going on there. People talk about I feel like when people talk about film and television in Los Angeles as well, a lot of the time they're talking about comedy, aren't they?
Sure.
So, I mean, could you cobble together ever an overall view of like what this gives you of the entertainment industry, seeing the porn stars, seeing the comedians, somehow were you able to craft any kind of perspective out of those two poles at once, even though they may have been the Achilles heel of your show, that you had them both on?
Oh, the two groups are amazingly similar.
Really?
And I don't think this is necessarily the answer to your question, but I would say they are as similar as any two diverse entertainment groups you can find. So now the products they put out are different, but the people attracted to those businesses are a lot of times narcissistic, yet have self-esteem issues. Who love the self-promotion, yet don't think high of themselves.
Yes.
Who are not drawn to your typical 9-to-5 jobs, or even your more typical 9-to-5 entertainment industry jobs. The stand-ups, they work at night. They sleep in late. The porn stars, they get a call saying you have to shoot a scene tomorrow, but then they might not work for a week.
Right.
It's very, very non-traditional in both ways.
The more you talk about it, the more it makes me feel like there could hardly be two more similar groups. I mean, if in comedy as in porn, if someone's a star, they're a star. They're carrying a lot of work for others upon them. If somebody's not a star, they're one of so very many who are all a little bit bitter toward each other. I mean, did you get that impression?
Yes, I would say so.
There's maybe there's aristocracy in both realms that operates similarly in sort of a vast serfdom.
I think you're also looking at it as someone whose head is screwed on pretty straight.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, I think there's just a lot of dysfunctional people drawn to it in the first place, so dysfunctional people are going to be catty.
I see. Well, it's a fair point, but it comes up on your new show, Man School. You have kept the comedians. You still talk to comedians, not only comedians, but comedians, and they will openly say that, correct me if I'm wrong, they will say that, nobody gets into comedy who isn't he doesn't have some kind of wound, right? I mean, that's a common sentiment, isn't it?
Sure, absolutely.
Do you think it's true?
I do. I do. And I think the grind of stand-up is just not made for people who are functional people. I mean, because first of all, you have to face what is the biggest fear of most people, which is public speaking. And not to mention, it takes so long to get good at stand-up that you have to suck. You have to deal with that rejection on a nightly basis. Way more than is normal, or way more than is tolerable by most. And I'm not a stand-up myself, but I just have a lot of stand-up friends, and being in the sitcom business, just know a lot of comedians. And you got to have a screw loose, and not that makes any of them bad people. Some of them are bad people, but I don't think makes you a bad person. But to be motivated in such a direction, it's you're just a different kind of person.
Now, tell me how you came to the conclusion that there was more to be learned from people you could potentially interview than what you were talking about on the Gentleman's Club.
I just got sick of the Gentleman's Club. I did the show for about 4 years, which so I worked briefly on the television show Animal Practice. That was on NBC last year. I
remember posters for that. Yeah. In Los Angeles, you see a lot of posters for short-lived shows. I mean, I know those images.
Yeah, right. There was a monkey who played a doctor. And this was a primetime NBC show. And what happened with Animal Practice was it wasn't especially good. So not a lot of people watched it, and it got canceled. So we got a call on a Thursday saying your show's canceled. Tomorrow's your last day of work. Pack up and go home. Now, that was a very clear end to a project. Right. And with new media, there's no rules. And there's no rules in ways to start things, but there's also no rules in the ways to end things. So I felt like I had to keep the Gentleman's Club going because I had listeners who cared, because I didn't know I could quit, and because it just filled a creative void for me.
Right.
But what happened was I just kept doing less and less episodes. A weekly show became every couple weeks and that sort of thing. And what I realized was I was just selling myself short. I needed to quit the show and come up with another idea. And it wasn't even that I needed to do another podcast. It was that I needed to be creative somehow, but I just needed to take the strain off of trying to produce more episodes of Gentleman's Club. And once I quit, it was just like my imagination opened up. And I decided that I had to find a topic I was passionate about to do a show that was more than just goofing around and an excuse to have porn stars over. Because I checked that off the list.
Sure.
And so what I came up with was one of my favorite things to do is just to have like deep, real, honest conversations with other guys about their life experiences. Whether it's, specific difficulties they've had, or whether it's like just amazing, unique experiences. And so I realized that was going to be my next show.
Tell me about... And this is something you allude to on a man. I keep wanting to call it Man Show. Very different thing. Man School. It's something you allude to on Man School, which is that you had been having these conversations with other men about how to handle life, essentially, and these were the conversations that made you want to produce essentially podcast versions of those conversations. I mean, was this kind of a thing that was going on your whole life? You realized you'd been having these kinds of talks and other people could benefit from hearing them? Or what was that?
It was a little bit of that, and it was a little bit more of a recent experience in that once I got sober, well, sort of what started before I got sober was just some conversations I had with my then boss, where he told me about some of his troubles he had in the past, and it was a way I was able to see how my shortcomings were getting the best of me, and I was at a point where I started realizing that I could have more for my life. I could have a good life. I could come up with some dreams and chase them, and because I was open to listening. And I was, curious about all these different things in the world. I just sought out a lot of different guys, and because of that, I just felt like I'd learned so much, but in a fun, enriching way. And I found out that also talking that way is very beneficial too. And so it's, it's something where sometimes I'll just talk to random people, and for example, I had I did a show for Man School where I talked to a guy who was kidnapped in Africa, and he was a guy who was a clerk at a retail store, and I just got in Hollywood. And I just got talking to him, and there was nobody behind me in line, and it just became like this fruitful conversation where suddenly I found out he had been kidnapped in Africa.
I need to know how this came up. That's the kind of thing I always want. I don't always want to hear people are kidnapped in Africa, but I want to get the story.
Yeah.
You want to get someone's stories, and it's tough to get them in a transaction like that. So how did he work that in, or how did you get it out of him?
He had a name tag that said a name that sounded Hawaiian, and his skin was so dark that he looked nothing like a Hawaiian, and so I was curious about what was behind that.
Too dark to be a Hawaiian. Out came that question. So,
too dark to be Hawaiian, yes. African parents who liked Hawaiian stuff.
I see. So he just volunteered that, I was kidnapped in Africa once. It's funny you should ask
I'd
about
asked
Africa.
if he'd been there before.
I see.
And that's how that came out.
I see. And then it's how quick from there to, I have a podcast where we could talk about the lessons you learned from that experience we talked about over the counter at the Apple store or wherever you were.
Which, by the way, it felt like such a weird pickup line
at
the time, and I felt like I was hitting on him because I didn't want to be rejected,
Right.
It was the same thing as if I was chatting with a lady.
Right, but he was receptive to this, clearly.
He was, yes, yeah, he was very receptive, which was good because I didn't get rejected, and it came out to be a nice show. But it was just a couple minutes, but I think when you approach people with sort of genuine curiosity and where you don't seem to have anything to gain from it, and just take an interest in people, like real stuff will come out.
Do you think our generation is any more incompetent at being men than the previous few generations? Do we need extra help?
Well, I suppose that's where like a little bit of confusion comes out with Man School. It's like, because when I first started doing the show, people are like, so wait, are you teaching guys how to be better men? And the truth is, like, no, I'm not qualified to do that. But what I do want to do is showcase men who've had experience that people can benefit from and learn from. And I think that is something that's not done enough. And especially at depth, because
it seems like the most basic thing too. Like, why aren't we just already having these conversations in life? How have we missed all this? Right?
Well, I don't want to sound like Grandpa Bacon here, but look, when you send in a text message, you're not going to get that deep,
right?
And an instant message or whatever it is. And I think especially here in Los Angeles, it's like I get in my car to go one way, and somebody gets in their car to go the other way. Like our
ships passing in the night.
Yeah, everybody's so scattered. Like I know I've spent plenty of time in New York where you take trains with your friends,
right.
and you're just chatting. But here it's different. So I think, and it's also a very go kind of place.
Right. Well, if you live near the train, your friends live near it, and your destination is near it, then you're good. But how often does that happen?
Has it happened?
I mean, to me, sometimes. But if you're going from downtown to here, or Koreatown to downtown, or the associate, there's the point being, there's no in Los Angeles. This is your point. There's so many ways to do things. How often are your ways going to overlap with other people's? Whether it's getting someplace or doing anything that you're going to even be in a sphere where you can compare notes, right?
Yeah. I even remember just on another side of the social spectrum. When I lived back east, I used to spend a lot of time in Boston, and I would have a friend who always had people over to his house before we'd go out to whatever bars or clubs. And that was usually better than going out, just everybody getting together and congregating in one location. And then I moved out here, and it was like nobody ever wanted to do that because it took so much effort to get across town to wherever you were going to go in the first place. It's just like, we'll just meet there.
Right. Things work a little differently because of the distances, because of the fact that your friend could be 20 miles away, and the other one could be 20 miles away from you both.
And I'm not complaining, because I do see a lot of advantage with Los Angeles in the fact that it's such a varied place. You have an opportunity to have more experiences here than you can have in other places.
Right.
But one of the things it means is, I think, less socializing, and especially at depth.
Now, is that Is that all? Is that all? Why why we haven't been having these conversations is we're a little bit, whether we're talking about these days or this city, we're a little bit too separate to have them at length? Or is there something else going on? Is there anything else going on? Or are we actually doing okay? And podcasting is just one more way we can bolster whatever advantages we have in manhood in the 21st century.
Well, I think for men, a big problem is asking for help. We are just terrible at it. Now, if I'm moving some furniture which I'm about to do,
yes,
and I'm having trouble because something's heavy and somebody's walking by and I could use a hand, I don't mind asking for help in that situation.
Right.
When it comes to being vulnerable, about my situation and throwing my ego out there, that's a lot more difficult. And what I find, maybe especially these days, is just not only guys do not want to ask for help, but they don't want to talk about things that are problematic or what's going wrong.
What's the kind of thing you have found or have realized through talking about it that men really don't want to talk about or think they don't want to talk about?
I think anything where you show weakness.
I see. So it can just be any area of life where you might show weakness, or is there some sort of, I used the term Achilles heel before, not to bring that out again, but what do you find ends up being one of those unexplored areas?
Well, I recently interviewed a professional poker player named Jason Somerville, and he's the first openly gay male professional poker player. And he came out 2 years ago, and no other guy has came out since. So he was telling me on the podcast that he felt that he was going to have all this backlash from his community of poker players, from his family, and that for him to come out of the closet basically meant throwing away life as he knew it. And the reality was that was not the case at all. So I think what I've learned from a lot of guys is that you just have a story in your head based upon how you perceive something as a weakness, and then how the world is going to treat you, how you expect them to treat you in a negative way.
Right.
And the reality is that's not usually what happens.
You've got the one thing you've been trying to conceal, and you build up a whole doomsday scenario about what happens when you do reveal it. And that never really comes true, does it?
I mean, I'm sure it has come true in some cases, or especially in the movies.
Sure.
But whether it's
anything's possible in the movies.
Sure.
Here in Dream Factory, here in the Dream Factory of Hollywood.
Well, when somebody comes out of the closet, or when a guy walks up to a bar to ask a girl out, you have the same conversations in your head, and it's just all ego stuff about different versions of, I'm not good enough, and because I'm not good enough, this is how it's going to go even worse than it should. And I think not only is that not usually true, but by just talking about that, you let a lot of the air out of it. And so that's been something that's been really helpful for me, is just being able to tell other men in my life, okay, here's some fears I'm having, and if it's someone who's had similar situations, a lot of times they'll just let the air out of it, because they'll say, actually, here's what happened to me. And then what I get to hear is not that cinematic situation where not only did the guy go up to ask the girl out, but he tripped on a table and fell into a candle and got lit on fire, as she said no.
Right. Is it a situation where you have to, for some of these guests, essentially jump in the water first to get them to jump in the water? Do you know what I mean by that?
I do, but not usually. But what I'll do is, usually have a decent conversation before we start the show.
Right.
So they get a sense of, I'm not looking to exploit them. I'm just a normal, decent guy. And a lot of times I'll have had some sort of relationship with a guest, or I've been vouched for. Something
has given you that, don't worry, he's cool type imprimatur for the guest. They know they can open up to you because you're not in every respect a stranger.
Yeah, and the apartment podcast environment is actually perfect for that, because it's not sterile. You're not in a studio. It doesn't feel corporate, and people will often say after the show, like, "Oh, I can't believe how relaxed I was." Right.
Now, you yourself are something of a professional podcast guest, right? I mean, you've been on a lot of them. You've been in this position on the other mic, not necessarily sitting right here, but quite a few times, right?
Yeah.
You're probably not keeping count, but I figure the first episode of this particular program, Notebook on Cities and Culture, was D.C. Pearson, who was also kind of a professional podcast guest. So listeners, I refer you to him for a comparison here, but what do you think you learn by being on so many podcasts about the craft of podcasting or even just talking?
Well, first of all, it's fun. And as somebody who works in Hollywood, you have a real set system for how things work. And with podcasting, you can do whatever you want. And so what's nice about that is to be in an environment where pretty much anything goes. And, even though people have different formats for their shows, it ultimately adds up to anything goes because they chose what anything is.
Right.
And so for me, it's like I kind of get to stretch some different creative muscles by doing that. And sure, I like it, but also I get to observe how other people do their shows and how they format things. And part of the fun of there being no rules for new media is that I get to see what rules people have created for themselves.
Right. And it seems it's a lesson you've learned from the transition from the Gentleman's Club to Man's School, just as I have from the old show I did to this one. It seems you've learned that you're going to be making rules no matter what, so you might as well own that and make the best rules you can or the most suited to you and your personality rules you can, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Because I think with podcasting, it's easy to fall into the trap of doing the easy show of like, right. Hey, we're two guys sitting around talking about what we watched on television last night.
Yes.
And that's fine for a lot of people because you don't have to have, professional aspirations with it. But kind of all along, I've suspected that I was going to go in a serious direction with this and, try and make a go out of doing something that would be impactful and seemingly professional.
Is there anything in common between the podcasts aren't going to last and the television shows this is probably not going to take flight?
I would say no, because the television shows that don't take flight usually don't necessarily have too much to do with the concept or the execution. Like,
right.
You would think so in theory, but there's a lot of classic examples like Seinfeld. Like, that show did not work at first, and they gave it a little bit more time. And they eventually, instead of canceling it, the show became what you've heard of Seinfeld, right, Colin?
I'm aware of this program. I mean, we're near Thai Town, as we've said. There's still a big billboard for Seinfeld right outside when you sit in one of the crispy pork restaurant. You can really see that thing.
Yeah, for
and
the
it's like you're back
syndicated version of Seinfeld. It's funny that there's a Seinfeld billboard, but it's
not going anywhere. It's going to be there for a while.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, there's, as long as the time slot stays the same.
Till the heat death of the universe. Seinfeld is an evergreen. But that seems like one of those shows that we've heard since hearing from, say, Larry David, who co-created it, and others, that there was quite a system of rules governing that show. It just seemed like there weren't. Or maybe at first there weren't. I don't know.
Well, the audience didn't care for the show at first.
Right.
And then people eventually came to the show. But with podcasting, you will have plenty of occasions where notable people already have an audience built in. They start a podcast, they've got plenty of listeners, but they do 30 episodes and then they're over it.
Right.
So even though they do have some success, they drop out. And that's not really comparable to, your more corporate television structure.
It is a quick hit for them, isn't it? If you're somebody who has some fame, built it up in some other older medium, film or television or radio, you can drop yourself into podcasting, have an instant audience, and that's not a concept though, ultimately, right? I mean, it's you see it so many times. And do you find when you're a podcast listener that you gravitate toward podcasters who have had to work a little harder because they are not themselves known?
I would say I'm 50-50.
50-50?
When Norm Macdonald recently came out with his podcast, I'm such a big Norm Macdonald fan that I was instantly going to listen to every episode of that show, no matter what. But then some other podcasts, me as a guy who's not Norm Macdonald, it's easy for me to root for the other guys who've came along the way and kind of built themselves up too. So that does add an element of fun to it. But there's plenty of fantastic shows, by people who were not on Saturday Night Live in the 90s.
You are now preparing for the first live edition of Man School, and it's for a podcast festival that I feel like no other city could have a podcast festival than Los Angeles. Do you think so?
I mean, unless you decided to just have all these podcasters convene on a city at once.
Right, because they'd all be coming from here, or most of them anyway.
Yeah, most podcasters are just commuting to this. They're not flying in.
What's going on with the live man school? Because listeners are going to be hearing this. They promote it to the listener of this show.
Well, Friday, October 4th, at the Los Angeles Podcast Festival in lovely Santa Monica, California, a few blocks from the ocean, there will be a 3-day event featuring many of my favorite podcasts and many of your favorite podcasts, I assume. And there's multiple rooms with multiple shows at once. And on the very first opening night, at the 7 o'clock time slot, in the main room, is the Mark Maron WTF podcast. And I would imagine that will grab a large audience. However, if you don't want to listen to the Mark Maron show, come to hear the live Man School show.
Are you up against the Mark Maron?
Up against Mark
live
Maron.
Yes. Oh my God! Did you get stuck with that, or did you voluntarily say, you know what? I think there's not going to be that big an overlap. I'll roll the dice on this one.
You don't think Maron's scared? Is that what you're saying? You don't think I'm going to take too much of his crowd?
I mean, his mind is elsewhere. He's got many irons in the fire.
He's got like cat litter on his clothes. He's worried about.
He's distracted. So this is the moment. This is your moment. He's not watching his back.
No, the entire night has got lots of heavyweights. Your Dana Goulds, your John Lovitzes, that sort of thing. But I happen to be opposite Mark Maron. But so what I'm going to do, because I usually just do a one-on-one show, I've decided to have a couple more guests, a guest co-host, and basically just liven up the format. I think because it's a comedy festival and a live thing, you want to have a good time. I will probably not be as serious as some of the shows, but I'm going to have Bald Brian from the Adam Carolla Show is going to be one of the guests. Yes,
he's been an excellent guest on Man School so far.
Thank you. Yeah, he was on one of the more popular episodes talking about his brain cancer. So what's so great about him is he can speak very honestly and openly about some very, very heavy stuff, but also with some levity, that makes him easy to listen to.
We talked a bit about the people in comedy. We talked a bit about how you still have comedians on Man School talking about their experiences. Do you get the sense that comedians make solid Man School guests because simply they've been through so much generally? They've had to be on the road, they've had to be around, they've had to hang out with other comedians. They have a few more. A comedian year is more than one human year, right?
I've never heard that analogy, but I like it.
It's got to be true, doesn't it?
I think so, but also they're good talkers.
Right.
So for Man School, first and foremost, I want it to be interesting. If there's ever some laughs in it, that's okay. It's not meant to be a comedy show. But I do have on a lot of other podcasters, a lot of comedians, and a lot of writers. Those are the communities that I participate in most myself. But those people are also have a good self-awareness. And I think for a lot of stuff I do in Man School, for example, just did a show with a guy who's a single dad.
Right.
And he's also a podcaster. But at the same time, that's a show that's best to do. His son is 14 now. And he's been a single dad the whole time. But if he had just had this kid 2 months ago, that's less of an interesting show because he's right in the middle of it. He can't really see things. But so people who've had situations they've now stepped away from who happen to also be good at talking, I think are perfect Man School guests.
Have you developed a sense now, sort of for the trying situation in somebody's biography? Like you hear someone's been kidnapped, you hear someone has had brain cancer, you hear someone has been a single dad for all 14 years of a kid's life. You hear a favorite episode of mine of Man School was a comedian who had, I believe, a 7-year relationship followed by a 1-year marriage with a lady, and then it was done.
Yeah.
Are your antennae, however you spell that, up for just those kind of endurance tests in life, and it's trying to feel out if a man has had those?
I think some of the shows I've done have been about achievements in life,
right?
But more of them tend to be about overcoming things, and a lot of times one of the big
hand in hand, right? Usually, right?
Well, I think in any achievement there is overcoming.
Right.
Usually, I think it's overcoming yourself and ego. But when it comes to a little bit more difficult things, I think that makes for a great episode. But because one of the things like I truly believe in is that you need to have life experiences. You can't just avoid things because you think there might be a problem. You know,
Right.
Like, you know, life needs to be lived. And so, unfortunately for David Nussbaum, who did the episode called "My 1 Year Marriage," there was somebody very much hurt by that. But boy, was it interesting to talk about what it's like to be married just for 1 year, divorced on the anniversary.
Is that a pattern you knew already existed going into man school, that a lot of times you're just getting over yourself in these challenges?
I didn't realize how much so until man school. I mean, there's definitely been a lot of things that I've seen consistent throughout people's experiences. Or one of the things that it was really, really nice. When I released that Bald Brian episode about him having brain cancer at age 30, which was the very first man school, a friend of mine who had a pretty major elbow injury, told me that it was helpful for him to listen to Brian about his cancer recovery because it gave him some hope, not in like the grand scheme, but just in the minutia of like how he dealt with what he was going through, because it applied to my friend's elbow injury.
Right.
And hearing that was like, it was nice, because it's like you don't need to have brain cancer to be able to take things away from Brian's story.
It gives you both perspective, like, well, at least my elbow injury, no matter how terrible it is, isn't brain cancer, but also, well, maybe it's not that different on its own scale. Like, it's a comparable challenge that is not threatening my life, but it's still comparable in that I can draw lessons from that story.
And the big thing is, so with Brian's cancer, you know, he was essentially trying to make slight progress until it added up to big progress. And that's what my friend especially connected to with his elbow. And I think what the slight progress is, like, especially in our culture today, geez, I'm Grandpa Bacon, but, you know,
keep going, Pops.
Of course people want things to happen quickly.
Yes.
But the things in life that are going to be the best usually take the most work, and that just means chipping away at it.
Several of your guests on Man School as well are travelers of one kind or another, or their stories have to do with traveling. I think of one who was kidnapped once in Serbia, once in Mexico City. You've mentioned the fellow in Africa. There's also non-kidnapping stories. One other fellow who was hitchhiking and Larry David picked him up, and he wrote a book about that. Travel seems like a decent a way as any to learn lessons about what you're like as a man. Have you found that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, where have been your places that have taught you a lot about Caleb Bacon?
I think a big one was moving to Los Angeles.
Really?
And so, basically, I mean, I've been here for a while now, but it took, and I felt very comfortable here right away. But having to live in such a different sort of place, I felt like I was a traveler for my first couple of years here. And
you still can feel like a traveler here, it seems like, because it's 500 square miles, because there's enough separation of communities that you do enter different cultures just by driving or biking or walking or riding even the trains around. But people kind of forget to do that after a while, it seems like. You know, you've been here longer than I have, but too long in Los Angeles, you do fall deep into a certain groove, right? And that happens.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, I'm moving to the Valley,
yes,
which most people consider giving up.
Is it? Oh.
Well, it's...
you do work in the Valley, though.
Yeah, I mean, it's more suburban. So basically, I got tired of a little bit of Hollywood street noise and things like that. So right. I'm looking for a little bit more comfort than I've had before. But what I've liked about living in a more urban environment, you know, urban for Los Angeles,
right.
Is that I think you're kind of forced to face things. And also what I like about where I live now is that it's an intersection of many different communities. And so I have an opportunity to have lots of different life experiences. And so for me, I'm somebody who chases that more. But definitely there was like a point where I had to say to myself, okay, I have to see the ocean at least once a month.
Right.
Because sometimes it's easy to not do that if you don't live by the beach.
It's only like 10 miles away, but still. 10 miles is 10 miles if it's not where you're going.
Exactly.
You say that coming here was a travel experience for you, but you also lived in Manchester, right?
I lived in Manchester, England, for a little bit of time after college and before I came here.
That had to teach you something.
It taught me so much. First of all, I love Manchester. And you're going to London pretty soon.
Yes, this show, listeners, is going to London at the beginning of next year.
Congratulations. That's super exciting. Now, have you been to London before?
No, this is, the show will go to Copenhagen in October, which will be my first trip to Europe at all.
Great.
And then London in January. But I guess what we're looking for is Old Man Bacon's tips for Europe, such as such as Manchester is Europe, and such as you accrued them while you were there.
Well, my thought about London is that London's not really England. Like, it's the same way that New York City is America.
Ah, I see.
In that it's just this cosmopolitan melting pot of a place that's not really reflective of the rest of the place. I mean, London is fantastic, don't get me wrong. But Manchester, you go there and you're like, oh, this is England.
Ah, I see.
You know, it's definitely more of like a go to the pub, more of an insular place. And there's a lot of pride in Manchester from the Mancunians. And it's just up in the north, there's like a different sense of humor, and it's very much a place that feels like its own place, not just a reflection of all the different people who live there who are from somewhere else. And so with Manchester, I really feel like I got to appreciate English people, and not just people from Manchester, but just all the sort of wonderfulness of all those Anglos. And, you know, like their big rival is Liverpool. Yes. Which is so close that it literally would be like driving from Los Angeles to Los Angeles.
Right, exactly. It's as if Norwalk and North Hollywood are rivals or something like that, right?
Yes.
I see.
Those places may not know each other exists, but yes. They're both here in the Los Angeles area. And in Manchester, I got to like read a lot of books, and I just finished college, and I had read a lot of books I didn't want to read, and so I had the opportunity to read books I wanted to read, and so I just go to a lot of like pubs or just places to sit around and do that, and so reading is something I do when I travel or I hit the road. That's a lot harder to do here, and it's one of the nice things about for me being away somewhere is that things slow down a lot, and I don't know how to slow down here. Like, I'm moving.
May not be possible.
Well, I'm moving in 2 days, and we're here doing a podcast when I clearly have more things to box up. It's like
sure.
I book my life very, very full.
Well, I did the same thing recently. It's like you're like the last chopper out of Saigon when you get that last carload out of your apartment. I mean, it's right there at the down under the wire. But tell me what sort of things you learn when you're an outsider, whether it's somewhere here or whether it is in Manchester. I feel like those the places you can make yourself into an outsider, or where you automatically are, those are the ones where you can cast the coldest possible eye on yourself. You know what I mean?
All right, so I'll give you two experiences here. When I was 19, I was going to a lot of nightclubs in New York City, and Albany's not that diverse a place. Like, it's not the middle of nowhere. It's a small city. But basically in my high school class, we had, like, the one Chinese kid, the one black kid.
There they go, the one.
And then we had, like, one Korean kid, so I knew that there's a difference between Korean and Chinese.
Right.
Which there is. But basically, when I would go to these clubs in New York, I would be dancing and partying with gay, straight, white, black, Hispanic, like just in kind of a way that I did not know existed. And I mean, a lot of clubs are not like that, but where I would go was like that. And so basically I got to see through the prism of dance music that, like, oh, we're pretty much all the same. And I know it's cheesy, and I was not necessarily on ecstasy at the time, but that was my experience. But I've also had the experience of, like, I was in Manchester, and this was right after the Iraq War broke out. And there was a lot of people not too happy with Americans. And so I was discriminated upon on a few occasions because I was American. Like people like yell at me about my president. And it wasn't that they were necessarily just throwing their voices my way because I was American, but they were treating me as though I was part of it. And so
you were made to answer for your nation.
I was, and I had never had that experience before. And I would have thought, like, oh, if I was going to be in that situation, I could just talk my way out of it and say, in fact, I agree with you on a lot of things you're saying. But it was basically like, no, I'm American, therefore I get nothing from certain people. And so that was I think that's a good life lesson, just because so many people do have that who, I come from a place where most people have pale skin like me, and that wasn't really an issue.
There became no way to get past that sort of you as a representative of a George W. Bush thing in England, or did that subside?
No, it was, it was not a lot of people,
Right.
but the experience happened a handful of times.
I see.
And I was able to see, like, just in the same way that someone might judge someone based upon the color of their skin, I was not going to convince someone that I was different, because ultimately I was American. And that's all I needed to know.
It seems like in the issue of finding all of our commonalities, when you're recording a man's school interview, you don't have to be steeped really in all of the guests' work, because you're there talking about what it's like being a man, being as reasonably effective, good, reasonably respectable a man as you can. You have that with the show's basis. You have so much common ground going in that it seems like it's almost secondary what the guest has done professionally. You know what I mean? It's interesting that for a show like yours, somebody could tune in because it's like, I know that comedian, but it's an experience where you almost don't want to talk about the work, right? I mean, it's secondary, if that.
No, each show is dedicated to a topic.
Right.
And it's about a life experience that particular person has had. So, their career doesn't really come into play too much. Which I love, because I don't want to talk about other people's careers.
Right.
It's not the show I want to do. And I had a lot of that with Gentlemen's Club, and a lot of times I would just get bored of that, because I would think, oh, maybe there's an interesting story about this VH1 show I never watched that this person did a few times. And, I would go to that well and not always like it. But ultimately, I don't really care about it that much. So I think because I have a passion for the idea behind Man School, even if the topic is going to be something that's a little bit outside, my own experience and understanding, the conversation itself is going to be something I'm passionate about. So I will definitely connect with that as a host and a man, whereas the whole thing about asking about someone's career, I'm not necessarily going to care about that. And I don't think that's good for the listener.
At the end of each Man School episode, you do distill into a few points some of the lessons from that particular class.
Will you do that for this interview?
I should do that, but I have to do it. Tell me this: how do you do that? How often do you have to? How many times do you have to listen through an interview before you really can distill this half an hour, 45-minute, hour-long conversation into a series of points that any man can use? Or is it so obvious what they are when you're talking that you just know?
Sometimes it's too obvious that I don't want to basically repeat something the guest really hammered home. So I'll have to listen to it a little bit more. But
what's a surprising lesson or two you've drawn out from a conversation where you were listening and thinking, that's not an obvious lesson. Maybe it's not even obvious listening to the conversation that's what you could draw out. But what are some lessons that you didn't expect to receive from doing the show yourself?
I'd say the big thing is I didn't expect to receive so many of the same lessons.
Oh, yes?
From seemingly, different guests with different experiences.
Well, let's get meta. What are the patterns here in the lessons?
The patterns are, one of the big things we talked about before was the best way to make progress is by small incremental gains. And whether that's progress going towards something or moving away from something,
right.
That's something that I've heard time and time again. And a big thing that I take away is just being honest. And a lot of times people have had to, in their lives, admit faults, weaknesses, embarrassing things in order to get over a hump. And that's something that comes up whether it's said as such or it's implied many times.
And worst of all, you've got to admit it to yourself. Sometimes it's easier to admit things to other people than
hard.
to actually accept your own stuff, right?
A friend of mine said to me the other day, he's like, one of the things I like about you is you're really good about asking for help. And there's an area of my life that I decided to get a little bit of help with recently, and it was like, no, that's something that's been bothering me for like 8 years. It took me that long to realize that I could benefit from not trying to figure it out on my own and actually asking for help. And I think the whole getting to that point is what's hard to see your way around.
Are there lessons and this is going to sound like a strange question, but lessons you expected to hear people talk about that they don't? Because, you think of this idea of men talking to each other, trying to figure things out. And there's cliched lessons you could think of. Tell me about avoiding the standard stuff, I guess. How much has that been a part of it in your mind?
Well, the way I approach Man School is not where I'm interviewing someone who's supposed to teach the audience.
Right.
They're sharing their experience.
Right. But from that you draw out what?
Well, basically the way I look at it is, in my own life, I've not responded well to people trying to teach me lessons.
Yes. Same here.
Yeah, and when it's the high school principal who was telling me not to goof around, like, I knew he had a point, but at the same time, it didn't resonate with me. So when people have their own experience, I feel like that resonates with me in particular very, very, very deeply, and definitely a lot of members of my audience. So I think the fact that the show is not about let me teach you something, but you can listen to this and take away from it what you will, I think that because of that you can avoid a lot of cliche things. Like if people were trying to teach these certain classes, I think it would fall into a lot of like, hey man, just be cool.
Just be cool. That's it. That stops there.
I mean, I would say like the best advice I've ever received is don't be a jerk.
Don't be a jerk. It's interpretable in a variety of different ways, too. That's what I like about it.
Yeah, don't be Steve Martin.
Is Steve Martin a jerk?
Well, he was in the movie The Jerk.
That's true.
He's the jerk. Okay, so don't be the jerk would be that advice.
Was the character a jerk? Wasn't he just dumb?
Yeah, he was not really a jerk to others.
I feel like that's a misleading title now that I really think back into the movie.
I think it's a very 70s title.
It is a very 70s title. But give me a sense of when you're writing for a medium like a television show, avoiding cliche there seems to be also of paramount importance. I mean, the shows that are just bundles of cliches aren't very well respected and often don't last. And avoiding cliche when you're just having conversations like on Man School, it seems like most of what you're doing in life is trying to steer around the tired stuff, trying to steer around the hackneyed. I mean, is that a similar task, whether you're podcasting, whether you're writing on television?
When I worked for a bunch of years for the great TV writer David Milch, who did Deadwood, NYPD Blue, lots of things. He was such a trailblazing artist that literally it didn't occur to him in his brain, oh, I need to avoid some regular television conventions.
Oh, they just weren't there in his mind.
No, they weren't there. Not to mention he didn't watch a lot of those shows.
Right.
And he was busy creating, not being a student of the game and then figuring out what's the way to beat the system by innovating. And with Sullivan and Son, it's supposed to be cliche in a lot of ways because it's supposed to go back to the time when television was a little bit simpler. It was you spent half an hour with some people and you didn't need to have seen the previous 6 seasons on the box set, to know the story, to be able to appreciate the episode. You could just turn it on, check out from life, and have some laughs. And so I think a lot of television has moved away from that, but I mean, television is comfort. A lot of times you have to be a little bit cliche because there's a reason that it became cliche in the first place, and that's because it worked.
There is, in a sense, the more difficult challenge of taking cliches and making them actually work. Easier almost to find something that's not cliched than to find a way to de-cliche the cliche, right? Because you watch an old show, you watch a show that perhaps wasn't very well written to begin with. You see the cliches. It doesn't have the intended effect. Nothing really gets into your mind. But now, if you want to use, in some sense, cliches or, comfortable television conventions, there's this sense where you can't just haul them out of the basement again, right?
Well, I think there's a low-hanging fruit you can certainly avoid.
Sure.
But when it comes to making a traditional multicam sitcom, you've got a very short amount of time to tell a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And a lot of times stories are kind of similar because when you just have that 3-act arc, it's basically like something happens, then there's a complication, and then something resolves it to get things back to normal. And so you can only go so far with that, which is I suppose good and bad. But you can't have a story that unravels so much that you can't get back for the end of the half hour.
Right. I've been speaking here in the intersection of Los Feliz, Thai Town, and Little Armenia with Caleb Bacon, writer on Sullivan and Son, and a host of Man School. Caleb, thanks so much for taking the time.
Colin, I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with all the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. Special thanks to everyone who backed Season 4 on Kickstarter, including Joel Neville Anderson, Daniel Levin Becker, Paige Calvert, Commander Manvark, Jonathan Crow, John Cunningham, David Dawes, James DeVito, Tim Dobbs, Paul Doyle, Jake Elliott, Kevin Emmett, Lawrence English, Jonathan Filbert, Andrew Philippone Jr., Michael Fransky, John French, Themistocles Eucrucius, Will Graham, Umberto Grant, Samuel Hansen, David Hayes, Jeff Hillenbrand, Mark Hines, Andrew Johnstone, Tadeusz Andrzej Kodlubowski, Peter Kavanaugh, Ted Kane, Andy Cooney, Evan Landman, Alfred Lee, James Maloney, Sean McDonald, Alberto Bruzos Moro, Jason Miller, Rob Montz, Daniel Murphy, Richard Nash, Aidan Nullman, Patrick O'Flaherty, Danny Olson, Michael O'Regan, Ian Blosker, Christopher Porter, MJ Pritchett, Piers Rippey, Rob Schultz, Todd Shimoda, Cam Smith, Deborah Smith, Adam Sutherland, Maureen Kincaid Speller, Anna Traher, Thomas Unterberger, Matt Warren, Nick Weigelt, Dion Wolf, Cynthia Yang, and Wayne Wright.